The Beta-Garmon system, once an unremarkable cluster of stars and worlds within the segmentum solar, rose to galactic significance during the twilight of the Horus Heresy. Its location made it a critical gateway to Terra, a final defensive shell before the siege of the Imperial Palace could begin. Yet the roots of its eventual destruction stretch far before the bombardment and planetary ruin. The worlds of Beta-Garmon had long served as a logistical network of forge worlds, way stations and supply hubs for the greater solar segmentum. Though it lacked the martial prestige of Ultramar or the ancient history of Mars, Beta-Garmon's value lay in its immense industrial output and its strategic position between several warp routes, especially those stemming from the Arteus cluster, the Eumenides Veil, and the edge of the Coronus Expanse. The system comprised over 12 primary celestial bodies, including major forge worlds, smaller manufactorum colonies, and defensive bastions outfitted by both the Adeptus Mechanicus and remnants of the Saturnine Ring. The most notable worlds included Beta-Garmon 2, 3, and 5, each terraformed over thousands of years to suit specific purposes. Beta-Garmon 2, designated Hellas, hosted vast data vaults and atmospheric conversion towers that once processed toxic winds into breathable air. Beta-Garmon 3, later nicknamed Furnace's Heart, was entirely converted into a warforge, producing armor plates for Titans and the internal components of Legio engines. Beta-Garmon 5 stood as a military bastion, armed with void shields, macro battery silos, and orbital defense grids that rivaled many frontline fortress worlds. The ruling command structures across these worlds were not monolithic. The Mechanicum had long maintained primary control, particularly over Hellas and Furnace's Heart, where Fabricator generals and Archmagos dominated the chain of command. However, this dominance did not go uncontested. The Imperialist militia, an auxiliary force loosely bound to the broader Imperial army, was deeply entrenched in Garmon 5, where high-ranking generals often clashed with Mechanicum overseers. These tensions simmered just beneath the surface during peacetime, and would become violently pronounced once the system found itself under siege. The biological populations of Beta-Garmon's primary worlds were diverse in origin, but uniformly moulded by decades of Mechanicum influence. Most civilian workers bore surgical grafts, respiration filters, or augmetic limbs by necessity, not preference. Heights varied depending on planetary gravity and occupational role. Forge line workers often stood hunched from heavy labour, ranging between 160 to 170 centimetres, while defence officers and inducted Skitarii units underwent genetic or mechanical enhancements that pushed their physiques well beyond baseline human averages. While skin pigmentation varied by region and ancestry, exposure to forge ash and industrial particulates left most inhabitants with sallow or grey-tinted complexions, with ocular implants or light-absorbing goggles being common among surface workers. Culturally, the Beta-Garmon system did not develop a unified identity. Instead, each world evolved its own dogma shaped by localized Mechanicum tenets, Imperial compliance edicts, and environmental necessity. On Hellas, spiritual syncretism between machine cult practices and older Terran faiths remained common, despite periodic crackdowns. Furnace's Heart developed a technocratic hierarchy in which production output dictated status. Garmon 5 adhered more closely to Imperial creed, enforced by militarum chaplains, but with noticeable ideological strain from prolonged proximity to Mechanicum dogma. The result was a fragmented but industrious population, hardened by toxic environments, trained under militarized doctrine, and saturated with technological reverence. The system's military doctrine was tailored to layered defense. The first line consisted of automated defense satellites and AI-managed macro platforms positioned throughout the system's periphery. These platforms operated on pre-programmed logic engines and would engage anything not verified via Mechanicum encryption. The second line involved mobile void fleets, primarily a mixture of Mechanicum Tagmata vessels and Imperial Navy frigates. These fleets patrolled internal warp routes and regularly skirmished with raiders or non-compliant shipping traffic. The final and most devastating layer was planetary defense. void shield networks across Hellas and Furnace's Heart, ground-based plasma artillery on Garmon 5, and the titans of the Legio and Legio Mortis stationed in waiting. These god machines served as both psychological deterrent and kinetic war asset, capable of glassing continents should a direct assault reach the inner system. At the start of the Horus Heresy, the Beta-Garmon system was not fully aligned with either side. This neutrality was strategic. While many within the Mechanicum had pledged to Mars or to the Warmaster, others held divided loyalties or remained committed to the Omnissiah of Terra. Fabricator General Calthor of Furnace's Heart was among the few who declared open loyalty to Horus, leveraging his control over production lines to siphon resources covertly. Meanwhile, the Skitarii forces of Hellas remained loyal to Terra, although communication with the wider Imperium was limited and frequently disrupted by warp storms. On Garmon 5, Imperial army commanders reinforced defensive positions without yet knowing whether their next engagement would be against traitor forces or allies turned uncertain. Recruitment within the system evolved rapidly as the war escalated. Initially, most defense forces were comprised of conscripted Forge World labourers and Skitarii formations bred and manufactured in bulk. These soldiers underwent intense indoctrination, physical enhancement, and weapon interfacing through neural jacks and cortical uplinks. Augmetic limbs, especially for heavy weapons teams, became standard. By the time full war reached the system, death tolls forced all 3 major planets to initiate emergency conscription programs. Civilians as young as 14 Terran years were inducted into servitor pipelines, converted into lobotomized combat units, or trained for basic infantry service under the direction of Imperial army officers or Magos Dominus-led Skitarii cohorts. Technology in Beta-Garmon reflected the peak of cooperative Mechanicum Imperial design philosophy before the full schism. Power armor suits used by elite defense cadres featured hybrid mechanisms, Mechanicum venting coils fused with Terran pattern ceramic plating. Standard issue las rifles were often modified for overcharge cycles, risking weapon failure but offering devastating punch in short-range engagements. Plasma-based artillery installations were maintained through both machine prayer and ritualized mechanical calibration. Machine spirits were widely recognized and placated through offerings, ranging from data scripture to physical bloodletting depending on planetary custom. Philosophically, the Beta-Garmon system hovered between the Imperial ideal of duty and the Mechanicum obsession with function. The machine cult's influence permeated nearly all levels of society, even among civilians unaffiliated with Forge World clergy. Concepts of self-worth were measured in production quotas, uptime metrics, or survivability indexes in combat. As the heresy advanced and desperation grew, these values calcified further. Sacrifice was expected. Compliance was not questioned. To fail in one's function was equivalent to heresy, whether before the Emperor or the Omnissiah. As the conflict began to encircle the system, prominent figures rose to prominence. Fabricator General Calthor wielded power through logistical control, ensuring that entire Legio engine complements vanished from registry records and reappeared under Warmaster banners. General Vokan, stationed on Garmon 5, was a decorated veteran of the Great Crusade and refused to yield ground to either traitor forces or Mechanicum interference. His troops were among the first to dig in along the outer defense bastions, and later orchestrated brutal counter-offensives even after orbital superiority had been lost. Magos Lexis, a bio-augmentation specialist from Hellas, spearheaded several dark experiments in post-human warfare, attempting to convert dead soldiers into semi-autonomous combat husks, capable of limited battlefield awareness. While many of these trials failed catastrophically, they foreshadowed the horrific ingenuity that would define Beta-Garmon's final days. Internal hierarchy was increasingly unstable as the war crept closer. On Furnace's Heart, dissenting magi were eliminated through staged reactor meltdowns or erased via internal logic purge trials. On Garmon 5, military and Mechanicum councils devolved into shouting matches and later assassinations. Information was deliberately restricted, with each faction attempting to hide troop losses or resource shortfalls from the others. Despite the looming threat, unity deteriorated. Paranoia spread faster than morale, and by the final month before open conflict, the Beta-Garmon system was less a united bastion and more a decaying corpse waiting to be claimed. The rituals of daily life, both military and civilian, became increasingly bleak. On Hellas, work shifts were preceded by mechanical liturgies and chemical incense rituals designed to suppress nausea and hallucinations caused by atmospheric degradation. On Garmon 5, morning drills incorporated not only weapon practice but rehearsals for orbital bombardment survival. Civilian morale programs involved staged celebrations of Imperial efficiency days, wherein the most productive units were rewarded with nutrient rations and temporary access to purified air chambers. Death became ritualized. Workers who died at their posts were often interred within machine housing, their names encoded into local cogitator networks as data echoes, digital ghosts endlessly repeating their last known coordinates. The battle for Beta-Garmon had not yet begun in earnest, but already the cracks were forming. Its origins were not sudden, nor its defenders unprepared. But as both the Loyalist and Traitor forces drew near, the people of Beta-Garmon stood upon a precipice, united only in their inevitability. By the final century of the Great Crusade, the Imperium's expansion had rendered the Beta-Garmon system more critical than ever before. As the Warmaster's betrayal loomed just beyond the edges of Loyalist intelligence networks, the system's forges ramped into overproduction. Titan chassis were completed at unprecedented rates. Skitarii cohorts were fielded without full weapon calibration. Orbital silos were stocked with macro warheads, whose guidance systems had yet to be tested in atmosphere. These rushed developments were not merely the result of loyalist planning, but of deep infiltration and quiet sabotage. Traitor-aligned Mechanicum agents, posing as loyal fabricators and maintenance servitors, slowly began altering production metrics, warping logistics manifests, and redistributing supplies to distant coordinates later identified as staging grounds for the sons of Horus and their allies. Meanwhile, Garmon 5 experienced a different form of tension. Unlike the more dogmatic Forge worlds, its military structure had deeper roots in Imperial tradition. Defense commanders like General Voken began noticing discrepancies in planetary stockpiles and unauthorized orbital launches. Requests for clarification from Furnace's Heart were either delayed or returned with incongruous data, often citing machine logic that only higher-ranking Mechanicum Magi could decrypt. This obstruction created deep divides between the Forge and the Fortress, each suspecting the other of negligence or manipulation. Surveillance servitors from Garmon 5 were eventually banned from entering Furnace's Heart, while Mechanicum emissaries began appearing on Garmon 5 with increasing frequency, offering assistance while silently collecting intelligence. As these fractures widened, Beta-Garmon's outer moons became staging areas for covert military preparations. Several of these moons, once considered economically irrelevant, were quietly converted into listening posts, munitions caches, or drop-point calibration arrays. Mechanicum records later recovered by the Inquisition showed that at least 3 moons, designated Gamma Tertius, Delta 4 and Kefil 6, underwent complete infrastructure overhauls over the course of 17 years, often under the pretext of terraseismic instability or waste disposal upgrades. These sites would later serve as key entry points for traitor titans and supply barges, allowing them to slip into the system before the battle's formal beginning. Legio Mortis, long known for its loyalty to the Warmaster, had already made contact with elements of the Beta-Garmon Mechanicum by this point. In the shadowed months before open conflict, several god engines were transferred from Mars to Furnace's Heart under ambiguous registry codes, labelled as restoration units or veteran platforms requiring overhaul. In reality, these were combat-ready Warlord and Reaver Titans, many already bearing the corrupted heraldry of Mortis, with armour plating freshly lacquered in symbols that defied the Imperium's sanctioned lexicon. Despite multiple reports from lower-tier tech priests about inconsistencies in their machine temperament readings, The senior Magos class suppressed these concerns and silenced dissent through ritual data wipes or mechanical reassignment. Culturally, these warnings were buried beneath a rising tide of productionist fervour. As the heresy reached its height beyond Beta-Garmon, many within the Forge World clergy began to speak of an impending crucible, a moment of technological revelation in which the machine god would separate the obsolete from the divine. This ideology, later termed the Crucible Doctrine, encouraged total compliance, absolute sacrifice, and silence in the face of contradiction. Those who questioned shifting orders or failed to meet output quotas were either executed or recycled. The Mechanicum's civilian population, especially on Hellas, fell deeper into ritualized conformity. Children were raised in data vault creches, where prayer routines and machine maintenance were indistinguishable. Upon reaching age 12, they were divided into 3 castes: labourer, servitor, or initiate. Only 1 in 20 survived to reach the initiate threshold intact. The rest were fed into the system as biological fuel, reprocessed into the cogitator circuits and servitor cores needed to maintain the forge. On Garmon 5, the population dynamic was more militarized. Entire families enlisted together, often stationed in the same defensive zones, living and dying in multi-generational trench networks that bordered the city foundries. Training regimens intensified as word of the heresy spread. While Terra's official communiques downplayed the Warmaster's treachery, Vox rumours and intercepted data threads painted a darker picture. The fall of Calth, the ravaging of Istvan, and the betrayal of Mars were known to many by fragmented code or survivor testimony. These half-truths bred both paranoia and purpose. Militants began organising under new unit banners, some invoking ancient Terran military traditions, others drawing upon Mechanicum symbology to inspire hybrid loyalty. Regimental cohesion fluctuated wildly. In some cases, battalions defected to the traitor cause overnight. In others, units self-immolated rather than yield ground to suspected infiltrators. From a technological perspective, Beta-Garmon during this prelude phase represented a hybrid evolution. Its forges had begun adapting older Imperial designs with radical Mechanicum innovation, sometimes crossing the line between enhancement and desecration. Infantry power packs were redesigned with volatile plasma converters, drastically increasing energy output at the cost of short-term viability. Vox units were encoded with language scramblers capable of masking speech even from machine spirits, leading to rampant miscommunication but enhanced operational secrecy. Experimental weapon systems were trialled on conscript populations without their knowledge. One such weapon, the Phase Shard Blaster, used compressed gravitic fields to shatter bone at a molecular level. It proved devastating in dense environments, but was banned following the unintended collapse of an entire hab block on Hellas during testing. Despite these technological breakthroughs, or because of them, Beta-Garmon was increasingly viewed with suspicion by higher Imperial command. Rogel Dawn, preparing the defences of Terra, received conflicting reports about the system's loyalties and preparedness. Some data suggested the region was a loyal bastion in need of reinforcement. Other missives implied deep corruption and likely betrayal. Unable to risk a misstep, Dawn refrained from deploying major reinforcements to the system, instead focusing on the construction of the Saturnine Wall and the orbital network above Luna. This decision, while strategically sound for the defense of the throne world, left Beta-Garmon dangerously undersupported at the most critical hour. Still, the system did not fall into chaos without resistance. Several internal attempts at counterpurging took place in the final years before the battle. On Furnace's Heart, a cohort of Loyalist Skitarii, calling themselves the Iron Silent, attempted to seize a data spire believed to house schematics for traitor Titan configurations. The assault failed after 28 minutes, resulting in the deaths of over 3,000 Skitarii, 7 tech priests, and the vaporization of 2 city blocks. On Garmon 5, a similar attempt unfolded under General Voken's direction. This operation targeted suspected saboteurs within the atmospheric shielding grid. The Loyalist forces succeeded in purging the infiltration cell, but at the cost of triggering a regional blackout across 20% of the southern continent. The blackout lasted 42 days and allowed multiple traitor supply landers to make planetfall undetected. As these events escalated, Beta-Garmon's inhabitants began to sense the inevitability of what was coming. Public broadcasts shifted from morale-boosting slogans to funeral rites spoken in code. Forge processions grew longer, more somber. Death quotas were no longer hidden but posted alongside production statistics. The phrase, "all ends converge," began appearing across cogitator networks, initially dismissed as a malfunction, later recognized as a traitor signal buried within firmware updates distributed by corrupted fabricator nodes. The system's logistics finally began to fracture in the weeks before the initial assault. Munitorum records indicate that over 100 million standard munitions, crates simply vanished from inventory, rerouted or stolen by internal operatives. Fuel reserves aboard Garmon 5's orbital silos were found to contain corrupted promethium stocks that ignited upon ignition, vaporizing transport crews. Ration packs were tampered with, some poisoned, others loaded with micromachines that infected their consumers with neural decay. By the time the first traitor fleets began to approach the edge of the system, Beta-Garmon was bleeding from within, its arteries cut not by external blades, but by treachery nested deep in its core. Still, even in the face of this decay, preparation continued. Defensive emplacements were calibrated, planetary shielding arrays were charged and layered. The Titans began to move. Massive god engines emerged from their maintenance cathedrals, each one a mountain of steel and fury. Princeps bonded with their machines in ritual communion, sacrificing identity for synergy. Skitarii ranks swelled with new inductees, many only partially trained, others driven by vengeance. The battle had not yet begun, but the system had become a loaded weapon, aimed at the void, waiting only for the enemy to arrive. At the centre of this coordinated response stood the Titan Legions, immense and ancient war engines that towered over the battlefield and represented the purest convergence of machine and mind. In Beta-Garmon, 3 primary legions had established presence, Legio Mortis and Legio Furians, aligned with Horus and Legio Solaria, who remained fiercely loyal to Terra. Each legion occupied separate bastions and docking cathedrals, embedded deep within the continental plateaus and under the jurisdiction of individual forged citadels. Prior to open hostilities, these forces were subject to diplomatic mediation, with Solaria issuing formal challenges to their traitor counterparts. Ritualized Titan duels fought under strict Mechanicum law. Several such engagements occurred under the guise of testing protocols, yet served to eliminate key assets before the full conflict ignited. Legio Solaria, known as the Imperial Hunters, operated primarily from Hellas and maintained their own internal command network separate from the broader Forge Authority. Their god engines, marked by sleek armour and advanced cogitator-linked weapon systems, were piloted by a predominantly female command structure, a unique distinction among Titan legions. Princeps Livia Quintar led the Solaria forces during the Beta-Garmon conflict, commanding a warlord-class Titan named Imperius Vindex. Her war record extended back to Ulanor, and her presence instilled a rigid discipline throughout Loyalist Mechanicum forces. Solaria's tactics prioritized speed, coordinated kill zones, and flanking patterns, unusual for Titans which were traditionally designed for brute force engagements. In stark contrast, Legio Mortis emphasized overwhelming firepower, siege discipline, and planetary destruction. Their god engines, heavily modified from Mars standard templates, bore corrupted circuitry, iconography of the Warmaster, and new command logic that overrode standard machine spirit limits. The Warhound Titans fielded by Mortis were particularly savage, equipped with enhanced targeting arrays and ritual-stabilized reactor cores that allowed them to fire longer without shutdown. Mortis engines frequently used psychological warfare, projecting vox howlers encoded with corrupted litanies that triggered seizures or panic in unaugmented infantry. Their Princeps often underwent irreversible neural fusion with their Titans, erasing individuality in favour of total war utility. On Furnace's heart, Legio Furians operated with a hybrid doctrine, blending the shock assault style of Solaria with the destructive rituals of Mortis. Their engines favoured ornate armour, often painted in deep yellows and black hazard patterns, resembling corrupted industrial warning signs. Known for modifying standard chassis with unstable reactor arrays, Freons deployed experimental weapons including graviton imploders and warp pulse cannons. These technologies, while devastating, frequently resulted in the spontaneous detonation of their own engines mid-combat. Princeps of the Furians were often former Archmagos or disciples of the Dark Mechanicum, and many had augmented their bodies beyond recognition, becoming more machine than man, often requiring atmospheric suppression tanks or exocoffins to survive outside of their command thrones. The scale of militarization within Beta-Garmon continued to escalate. Skitarii legions, originally assigned to factory protection and surface patrols, were redeployed into formal military divisions. These units were often refitted with heavier war gear such as phosphor torches, transuranic arquebuses, and arc mauls. The cohort known as Alpha Red 9, assigned to the northern hemisphere of Garmon 5, conducted some of the earliest successful anti-armor maneuvers against encroaching traitor vehicles, utilizing combined drone scouting and guided missile clusters. Other Skitarii groups, particularly those loyal to Solaria, formed permanent escort cadres for Titans, acting as battlefield scouts and perimeter enforcers during engine engagements. While most civilian industries were repurposed for war, not all populations were evacuated. Entire city sectors remained operational under the logic that shutdown would cripple logistical throughput. On Hellas, workers continued to operate plasma funnels and atmosphere converters while wearing minimal radiation shielding. Data suggests over 2 million civilian deaths occurred in the final 3 weeks before enemy arrival, many from environmental exposure, others from industrial accidents exacerbated by wartime pressure. Yet the Mechanicum refused to halt operations. Every output cycle, no matter how costly, was treated as sacred. Its interruption would be considered heresy. Within the Mechanicum hierarchy, rites of preparation grew increasingly grim. Machine anointing rituals became bloodier, with many magi replacing sacred oils with biological components, including harvested organ fluid and cortical paste from condemned traitors. In one recorded instance, a forge priest was elevated to Archmagos status after sacrificing 30 servitors to a plasmacore shrine in a ceremony lasting over 9 hours. These rites, though unofficial, became normalized. Even loyalist tech priests began invoking symbols once considered borderline heretical, desperate for favor from any power that might grant survival. Meanwhile, communication between the planets degraded further. Encrypted channels became saturated with conflicting orders. Furnace's Heart often ignored transmissions from Garmon 5 entirely, citing logic mismatch errors as cause for non-compliance. Hellas relied increasingly on cogitator intermediaries, automated systems that parsed data and translated it into executable action without human oversight. This resulted in several tragic incidents, including the unintended orbital bombardment of Beta-Garmon 6 by a Mechanicum defense satellite after its targeting logic misread a friendly ID signature. Among the many internal fractures was the emergence of an unsanctioned paramilitary movement known only as the Covenant of Iron. Believed to be a splinter cell from Legio Furians, this group operated autonomously within the lower hive levels of Furnace's Heart, conducting acts of sabotage, forced augmentation, and ritual sacrifices aimed at awakening dormant machine spirits. Evidence recovered post-conflict indicates they may have been responsible for initiating a multi-kilometer reactor overload which sterilized an entire manufacturing sector, killing over 75,000 inhabitants and erasing nearly 2% of the planet's forge capacity. Despite these failures, Beta-Garmon's defenders were not blind. They understood the magnitude of the incoming threat. Recon probes detected energy signatures consistent with large-scale void fleets at the edge of the system. Vox transcripts recorded as early as 3 weeks prior to first contact refer to blackened suns and death choruses approaching from the northern warp corridors. Orbital auger platforms attempted to scan the region, but were rendered blind by ion distortion and data jamming code beams. an early sign of traitor fleet tech that would later become standard across Horus's advance. Still, defensive protocols were executed with precision, interception grids were recalibrated, ground-based shield pylons pulsed into full activation, Titans began to assume combat positions in defensive cradles, while Skitarii legions dug perimeter trench lines around vital infrastructure. Battle was no longer a possibility, it had become an inevitability. Command across the system reached a new state of fragmentation. General Vulcan, still holding firm on Garmon 5, declared martial superiority over all non-forge elements, a declaration ignored by the Mechanicum. In response, Fabricator General Calthor declared all Imperial chain of command nullified due to active warp-based contamination of decision matrices. Loyalist commandos attempted to assassinate Calthor in the weeks leading up to the initial invasion, but failed, triggering a retaliatory purge that saw over 500 military personnel arrested or liquidated. Garmon 5 responded by cutting off all supply shipments to Furnace's Heart, instead building a local fallback depot. By this point, the Beta-Garmon system had effectively become a civil war within a civil war. The rituals of loyalty evolved as conflict neared. Loyalist units began embedding purity seals within their flesh, branding the Aquila directly onto their augmetic limbs. Skitarii platoons ran self-immolation drills, preparing to destroy themselves rather than fall to traitory programming. Tech priests initiated silence vows, communicating solely via electro-signal to avoid verbal corruption. Even civilian groups began forming local cults, unorthodox but fervently loyal to the throne, chanting litanies to the Emperor from within their factories as sirens blared across blackened skies. And then the void blinked. Long-range augurs detected the first signature spike. A fleet, immense and dark, shifted from warp space less than 200,000 kilometers from the outermost moons. Moments later, dozens more appeared. The Warmaster had arrived, not through stealth or sabotage, but in full force, as if daring the defenders to stop him. The siege of Beta-Garmon had begun. The first official record within the Adeptus Administratum regarding the Beta-Garmon conflict was filed under Clearance Level Lambda on Furnace's Heart, dated to Millennia 31 Year 4. It was labelled Strategic Engagement Forecast, Segmentum Solar Western Shelf, and it outlined the possibility of a system-wide military engagement involving Mechanicum assets and unidentified hostile forces. At the time, the file received only regional attention, mostly due to its ambiguous threat designation and the absence of direct mention of the Horus Heresy. Analysts within the subsector auditorium flagged the data as probable misclassification, citing no movement from Orc warbands, Dark Eldar raiding signatures or recorded warp storms. Only one name appeared on the flagged memo, General Vulcan. By the time the conflict escalated into open war, the Administratum had established a full command bursary presence on Garmon 5. Overseen by Magisterial Clerk Halros Divan, the office processed over 3,000 daily communiques regarding planetary logistics, Imperial Guard deployment records, and mechanized supply demands. These records were catalogued through Voxlog, stamped with multiple seal codes, and verified against both Machine Cult and Munitorum registries. This was one of the few instances where the Administratum operated concurrently with Mechanicum oversight. Most often, such overlaps resulted in jurisdictional disputes or delays. But at Beta-Garmon, the urgency of the Warmaster's advance created a rare window of cooperation. The Administratum's initial assessment of the Beta-Garmon system described it as a volatile but strategically essential industrial corridor. Its forge worlds produced over 13% of all Titan support infrastructure in the Western Segmentum Solar, including void shield harmonics, reactor core subframes, and hard light refractor coils. Garmon 5 alone maintained 12 major orbital staging docks capable of fielding planetary invasion forces across 3 systems. These docks were not only military assets, they served as critical refueling and data anchoring stations for warp-capable vessels moving between Segmentum Solar and Obscurus. With these nodes compromised, the Adeptus Terra feared a collapse in supply line synchronization across 32 nearby star systems. The earliest confirmed sighting of a traitor-aligned fleet was logged by Augur Station G5 Omicron, orbiting the gas moon Theltis. The record, preserved in Administratum Vault ST55343, describes an anomalous object emerging from the warp with an energy discharge equivalent to 30,000 plasma bursts. At first classified as a malfunction, the signal reappeared 17 minutes later, accompanied by 16 other identical spikes. The station's senior sensor analyst, Archivist Deacon Rix Talvard, noted in his log that the readings were identical to Martian heavy engine displacement, but distorted as if the engines themselves were wounded. That phrase would later be used in multiple subsequent reports to describe the traitor fleet's unnatural warp sign. Garmon 5's High Command transmitted a formal warning to Terra soon after, routed through encoded Mechanicum channels and duplicated for Administratum review. This communique included preliminary fleet silhouettes, classifying 3 of the inbound ships as Gloriana-class battleships. One, believed to be the Vengeful Spirit, bore structural damage consistent with prior battle records from Istvan. The report never reached Terra in time. The warp routes had become flooded with data noise, warp echoes, and misdirected signals. Several files returned to their sender, corrupted and timestamped centuries into the past, a common symptom of warp time dissonance during the late Heresy. Administratum scribes stationed within the forge spires and orbital docks began compiling personnel mortality reports as the first traitor ships entered range. These were logged hourly. Initial estimates show the first bombardments on Garmon 5 resulted in nearly 160,000 confirmed deaths within 12 minutes. These figures excluded the unverified missing, which rose by the hour due to crater displacement and data core fragmentation. On Furnace's heart, over 4,000 servitors ceased function simultaneously following a system-wide data burn, believed to be caused by a signal intrusion originating from a captured Mars-based relay drone. Records from Subdata Register 46 Delta noted the intruder code contained partial fragments of a corrupted Cant Mechanicus litany, overlaid with audio from a pre-Imperial Terran hymn. The litany has never been successfully decoded. Within the first solar day of the invasion, the Administratum's internal casualty estimate surpassed 500,000, excluding Mechanicum data forms or non-registered civilians. These numbers were adjusted upwards daily, despite growing gaps in reporting. Many archives from the Garmon 5 central data vault were destroyed during a series of targeted orbital strikes. Archivists on site logged final entries before the data links failed, including a message from Adept Gres Ulven, who reported that the skies above the vault are dark with metal angels, and the ground beneath us hums with doom. His entry terminated 11 seconds after transmission. His body was never recovered. The Administratum's emergency protocol for situations of planetary destabilization, Codex Alpha Phi 99, was triggered on Hellas shortly thereafter. This order permitted the execution of administrative conscripts who failed to maintain function under combat stress. Over 600 adepts were either executed or chemically neutralized within the first week, often by their own overseers, in order to preserve clarity of data transmission. The policy, while severe, was defended in post-conflict reviews as necessary for operational continuity. These reviews were archived on Terra under sealed record until the end of the Heresy. Records indicate that between the first confirmed fleet signature and the second orbital wave, 23 major skirmishes took place in the upper stratosphere of Garmon 5. Administratum orbital logs detail collision reports between defending Navy vessels and inbound traitor craft, most notably an incident in which the Victus Imperialis, a lunar-class cruiser, rammed a traitor Gladius variant frigate, destroying both in a fiery descent into the Garmon 5 skyline. Visual confirmation was preserved from multiple sensor feeds, 3 of which survived and were converted into Vox archives for Imperial morale broadcasts. Simultaneously, civilian evacuation efforts failed to meet expected benchmarks. Of the projected 400 million citizens tagged for extraction across Beta-Garmon, only 73 million were successfully transported off-world before warp lockdowns trapped the remainder. The Administratum notes several evacuation craft were denied docking clearance at Mechanicum-controlled platforms, their launch orders overridden by internal cogitator errors attributed to Machine Sovereignty Protocol 214.11, a pre-Imperial failsafe known to reject non-sanctioned civilian vessels during full-scale military engagements. Despite repeated override attempts by Garmon 5 Command, the protocol could not be disabled. Survivors later described seeing entire passenger ships vaporize mid-air as defense grids failed to distinguish between civilian and hostile targets. A secondary transcript from a Vox channel labeled Dominus Relay Theta confirmed the reactivation of multiple dormant planetary defense grids originally built during the Unification Wars. These systems had not been used for over 4 millennia and were powered by geocore siphons located beneath Hellas. The reactivation sequence burned out half of the siphons in under 6 hours, triggering minor quakes across the southern tectonic plate. Administratum emergency analysts attempted to warn against further activation, but their transmission was buried beneath higher priority Mechanicum data. The defense arrays successfully repelled 2 enemy landing barges, but then misfired, destroying a Loyalist supply convoy transporting Skitarii reinforcements. That incident was marked as irreconcilable friendly fire loss and sealed from the public record. The tone of Administratum reports following the first week of open conflict shifted notably. No longer clinical or procedural, many began to include personal annotations, warnings, and prayers embedded within log entries. Adepts who once filed standard incident reports began closing their transmissions with phrases such as Ave Imperator in shadow, or Forgive this data, for I am afraid. One analyst, Scribe Lexis Falteverin, wrote, If Terra does not hear this, know that we were loyal, and that the light of this place burns as it dies. His final report detailed the disappearance of an entire Skitarii battalion from grid sector Tau 9, without signs of conflict, transport records, or remains. The report ends with a string of corrupted glyphs that do not match any known Imperial encryption schema. Despite the chaos, the Administratum continued to operate until complete communications loss on Garmon 5 Hellas and Furnace's Heart. The last functioning cogitator broadcast was received on Terra 17 days after the invasion began. It contained no readable data, only a 7-second audio file of metallic chanting layered over the sound of collapsing infrastructure. The file was archived under the designation Beta-Garmon Final Transmission, and remains restricted under the Inquisitorial Black Vault Registry. As the siege on Beta-Garmon deepened, Administratum and Munitorum records began to reflect the full breadth of the conflict's strategic value. Beyond its proximity to Terra, the system served as the primary convergence point for over 9 adjacent warp corridors. Each of these routes, designated by Imperial chart code as transit veins Theta 4 through Zeta 22, formed a lattice of supply movement, naval projection, and astropathic signal relay vital to the defense of the solar segmentum. Control over Beta-Garmon meant control over signal parity across a quarter of the Northern Imperium. With the Warmaster's arrival, those veins collapsed into tactical ambiguity. Warp routes destabilized under the weight of psychic resonance and conflicting astropathic chants, many of which were later attributed to traitor demonic interference. The earliest documented instance of total system disruption was logged by the Munitorum expeditionary frigate Heraldian Light, which attempted to transit from the Cypra Mundi station into Garmon 5's upper orbit. The ship's final transmission was a partial Vox log describing internal hull anomalies, flickering vision among crew, and sudden alterations to time perception. The commanding officer's voice degraded mid-transmission, ending in a loop of her final words. We have not arrived. We are still arriving. We have not arrived. The wreckage of the Heraldian Light was later recovered from the upper stratosphere, its internal clock over 500 years out of sync with real space-time, a result of sustained exposure to corrupted warp bleed. Administratum entries filed the incident under Psychic Entanglement Event Class Epsilon. In the weeks that followed, the primary concentration of traitor forces converged on Garmon 5's equatorial continental shelf. where the majority of the system's ground-based command and storage centres were located. Adeptus Mechanicus data interpreted these movements as part of a multi-phase encirclement manoeuvre. However, Administratum analysis noted inconsistencies in the offensive structure, specifically the delay between orbital dominance and planetary deployment. According to analysis logs recovered post-war, this pause was attributed not to disorganisation, but to the deliberate ritualised activation of demonic engines among the traitor forces. Visual confirmations from surviving recon thralls revealed Titan-class silhouettes emitting multi-spectrum energy signatures inconsistent with standard plasma emissions, as well as battlefield discharges of warp-sourced radiation that altered terrain, atmosphere, and even gravitational fields. Administratum records from the Garmon 5 High Command show several attempts to deploy Terminator-clad kill teams into forward trenches to slow the advancing war machines. These efforts were initially successful. One engagement, catalogued under Operation Code Red Halo, saw a squad from the Firelords chapter annihilate 3 corrupted Warhound Titans using coordinated melter strikes and drop assault lances. However, as recorded in the after-action logs of Marshal Knight Devrin Kelst, the engines did not die clean, their cores wept light. One continued to move without mass, its echo burning behind it. This phenomenon, later matched to warp echo drift, marked the increasing frequency of traitor forces fielding psychomechanical constructs that exceeded Imperial expectations for conventional battlefield logic. The second documented mass engagement took place at Garmon Hive Delta, a once vital logistical hub connected to the primary forge rail network. Vox archives from Mechanicum and Administratum record conflicting narratives of the event, though all agree on the outcome. Hive Delta was obliterated in less than 9 hours. According to the transcript filed by Scriba executor Hanel Trosk, the attack began with a visual anomaly above the hive, a black orb slowly expanding surrounded by lightning arcs. It did not fall like a ship, nor detonate like an explosive. Instead, it ruptured reality itself, consuming Hive Delta in a gravitational collapse measured at 2.7 kilometers per second squared. No traitor fleet was present in orbit at the time of impact, and no inbound munitions were detected. The phenomenon was deemed anomalous void ignition, and records note that Trosk's transmission ended mid-entry. His final words were, "I cannot see the ground. There is no more ground. It is not there anymore." Following the loss of Hive Delta, Administratum clerks began relocating key data cores and hard-scripted registries to deep vaults in the southern subplate trenches. The relocation protocol, designated Directive Kappa Orion Black, allowed for selective data preservation in the event of system collapse. Over 30 million datasheets, including combat footage, logistical movements, and encrypted astropathic records, were embedded within servo capsules and launched into stable orbit. Of the 72 capsules fired, only 18 were successfully recovered by Loyalist forces after the heresy. These capsules serve as some of the most vital historical sources for the Beta-Garmon campaign, and nearly all were eventually processed and catalogued in the Hall of Remembrance on Terra. Further reports document the deployment of multiple Titan maniples under Legio Solaria and the temporary allied presence of Legio Astorum, also known as the Warp Runners. Astorum engines deployed via low-orbit grav-drop modules, descending directly into contested city sectors to reinforce Solaria lines. One of the most critical engagements involved the defense of Forge Bastion 19A, where a pair of Solaria warlords, supported by Astorum Reavers, held off 7 corrupted Titans from Legio Furians. The battle lasted 16 hours. Excerpts from Princeps Adonerail's combat log detail the engine Dominus Angelicorum suffering leg joint disintegration, only to stabilize using anchor pylons embedded into collapsing architecture. The traitor forces were eventually pushed back, but all Loyalist engines were declared non-functional by battle's end. Administratum after-action surveys revealed that by the 32nd day of siege, over 70% of Beta-Garmon's rail lines, maglev corridors and aerial docks were non-operational. Food synth production had dropped below 30% capacity. Atmospheric filtration systems in 4 of the primary hive cities had failed entirely, forcing survivors into sealed undersectors. Still, resistance persisted. Administratum records indicate that over 200 separate Imperial Guard regiments, many formed from hastily conscripted local militia, launched over 500 coordinated counterstrikes during this phase of the campaign. These engagements were largely suicidal, but they succeeded in delaying traitor mechanized advances long enough for Mechanicum Titans and Skitarii detachments to reposition into more defensible terrain. The Administratum's formal appraisal of the campaign shifted again after what was classified as the event at Furnace's heart. On the 38th day, a series of thermonuclear detonations, each matching the estimated energy release of a Starship-grade plasma core, tore through the outer hemispheres of the Forge world. Surveillance-picked feeds from orbital Vox telescopes captured a cyclopean shockwave expanding in an almost perfect dome across the northern hemisphere. For several minutes, static washed out all data channels. When signal returned, the Forge's entire northern data network had gone silent. No survivors were recovered from that sector. Post-battle assessment by the Adeptus Mechanicus would later suggest that the detonation was initiated internally, possibly by Loyalist Magi attempting to deny the Forge's core reactor systems to the Warmaster's forces. Administratum sources mark this as the single most significant infrastructure loss in the Beta-Garmon system, eliminating over 20% of heavy weapon production and fully collapsing 7 Forge-link data networks. The final logged act by Administratum Command on Garmon 5 was the sealing of the Vault Primaris in the subterranean Temple of Archives. Overseer Curator Theon Malchius initiated the closure via triple-authorized coglock and encoded the exit phrase into a microscribe thread embedded into his spinal node. The vault contained the complete record of the Beta-Garmon engagement up to that point, over 4 million entries, including Vox reels, casualty maps, and transcript archives. The vault was later found by forces under the command of Robute Guilliman after the Heresy, its contents decrypted and sealed within the Imperial archives on Terra. As Beta-Garmon entered its terminal war phase, Adeptus Administratum files began showing sharp declines in coherence, organization, and internal transmission quality. Several scribal hubs within the system had already been reduced to dust or lost to warp interference, but the remaining data centers continued to upload fragmentary logs, each one shorter, more erratic, and often corrupted. Administratum doctrine dictated that these logs continue transmission until either death or system disintegration. That doctrine was followed with a near-fanatical dedication by the last surviving adepts on Garmon 5, Furnace's Heart, and Hellas. The final confirmed data file from the Garmon 5 surface was labelled Delta Extremis Compiled Incident Entry, Vault Chain 14B. It originated from the subterranean sealed archive plateau beneath Hive Orion. The transmission, recovered years later from a crashed Vox satellite in the Obscuran Verge, was corrupted in several sectors, but decipherable enough to offer the last complete Administratum report from the Siege's ground level. In it, Overseer Scribe Heskel Prim issued a stark evaluation. Civic order nullified, Munitorum override ineffective. All defensive code networks now operate under Forge autonomy protocols. Human command input rejected. The message ended with a short prayer fragment. Emperor, index my record. As traitor forces closed in on the remaining cities, the Administratum attempted to initiate fallback evacuations through a series of underground monorail vaultways left over from the Dark Age of technology. These ancient rail systems, barely functional, had long been buried under strata of rockcrete, data core expansion nodes, and forgotten purification tunnels. Clearance for these paths came directly from surviving Munitorum tech adepts, who issued retro key codes to interface with the near-sentient security gates left by ancient Mechanicum founders. These routes were intended to be used exclusively by senior Administratum officials, archivists, and high-clearance scribes. But as the conflict worsened, civilians and wounded guardsmen forced their way into the tunnels, turning the system into a chaotic exodus corridor. Vox reports indicate that multiple tramcars were over capacity, leading to frequent derailments, air suffocation, and mass panic stampedes. One recovered report, logged under code Theta Magnus, details the collapse of Vault Line Sigma 4. The tunnel flooded with toxic coolant fumes after a failed reactor purge in the overhive above, which was struck by indirect fire from a Furion's Hellstorm Titan. The scribe's entry ends with a description of lungs cooking in the breath of a dying god engine. Seismic recorders indicated that this was only one of 32 major tunnel system collapses across the mid-plateau sectors, causing over 4 million estimated fatalities in a span of 42 hours. Most of these were not caused by combat, but by infrastructure degradation, resource collapse, and civilian gridlock under siege pressure. The battle for Furnace's Heart became one of the most logistically dense conflicts ever recorded in Mechanicum and Administratum history. Over 1,000 Titan-class war machines, nearly 70,000 Skitarii maniples, and hundreds of guard regiments were funneled through increasingly narrow choke points formed by collapsed hive structures, slagged manufacturer, and war-cratered rail hubs. Administratum analysts flagged this battlefield as Tactical Spiral Category Sigma Null, a rarely used term applied only when strategic objectives have collapsed into unresolvable attrition. It was estimated that for every kilometre of ground gained by either side, no less than 2,000 combatants died. Some trench zones changed control over 20 times in 3 days, with Vox beacons destroyed and rebuilt so frequently that location coordinates were often days out of sync. Amid the data collapse, one of the last comprehensible status logs from the Furnace's Heart engagement came from High Adept Valentia Surask, a data command official overseeing perimeter defense grid indexing. Her final transmission described enemy titans burning with colors that were not part of our visual spectrum, and aerial war machines whose weaponry caused bleeding in the air itself. Her language degraded rapidly into nonsense before the signal cut off entirely. Attempts to translate her final glyphs into binary failed. Magi working alongside the Administratum declared the glyphs logically consistent, but linguistically impossible. Meanwhile, reports from Hellas show that the Hive's central Administratum hall collapsed following a chain-reactive sabotage of its vertical maglev rail cluster. Evidence suggests that Loyalist infiltrators attempted to overload the central lift engines to prevent their use by traitor forces. The resulting core breach vaporized 7 levels of data storage infrastructure, taking with it over a century of regional economic, political and military records. Surviving Vox transmissions from nearby observation stations noted a secondary anomaly. Some of the records that were lost began reappearing on other servers across the system, rewritten, reordered, and time-stamped incorrectly. Several of these files were later flagged as warp echo artifacts by the Inquisition and sealed from further review. Another major collapse occurred within the communications nexus of Garmon 5's outer orbital relay ring. This network, which had once serviced over 100,000 signal entries per cycle, fell into silence over the course of 70 hours. Surviving transcripts suggest the relay crews maintained transmission as long as possible, relaying everything from battle coordinates to casualty reports to brief personal messages addressed to loved ones on Terra. One scribe, Isan El-Kadi, ended her final entry with a quiet line. "It is not that we are losing, it is that we are being erased." Her message was followed by 23 seconds of static, then silence. The system was never reactivated. Administratum records also confirm the destruction of the Macro-Auspex survey station on the fractured moon Delvius Tertius. This orbital station served as a predictive data hub that processed gravitational warping and enemy fleet movement in the Beta-Garmon orbital shell. The station's final report, recompiled from a partially recovered data core, described an object the size of a hive spire cloaked in mirrored armour, which appeared above the Forge World and blocked all long-range scans for 2 full days. What this object was remains undocumented. No other records mention it directly. Its appearance correlates only with the abrupt disappearance of several major traitor fleet elements, whose re-entry trajectories were never recovered. By the close of the Administratum record trail, the system's internal structure had entirely broken down. Hierarchical authority collapsed. Scribes acted without order. Data was transmitted redundantly or not at all. In several documented cases, adepts were seen physically protecting server banks with their own bodies, using flak armor and lass rifles. None were expected to survive. One final act recorded in Furness's heart came from the last surviving member of Command Node 3V. A full week after the Vault Primaris was sealed, this individual, whose name was never recovered, transmitted a single fragment over a dead channel. We held. The data was the Emperor's light. We gave it back to him. No response followed. The transmission ceased 6 seconds later. The Inquisition's earliest recorded interest in the Beta-Garmon theatre predates the major outbreak of conflict by approximately 11 standard years. This is confirmed in a redacted segment from Vault Ledger Canticum 7, preserved under Ordo Hereticus classification seal, where the system is described not as a strategic hub, but as a warp topographical anomaly of unexamined depth. The ledger notes that several inquisitorial astropaths stationed in the vicinity of the Segmentum Solar's western fold had received identical dreams, visions involving a burning giant made of bone and circuitry surrounded by uncountable watchers with mechanical eyes. At the time, these reports were dismissed as low-tier psychobleed, possibly the result of long-term exposure to Mars-based noospheric rituals. Inquisitor Malsist of the Order Malleus disagreed. She filed a preliminary request to station observation probes in system. Her request was denied. That denial would later be cited in the post-war Black Inquiry as one of the failures that allowed the Beta-Garmon catastrophe to reach full maturity. According to declassified content from Inquisitorial Tribunal Notes 9 Epsilon, at least 3 full audit teams were dispatched to the system during the first months of the heresy, none of whom were formally acknowledged by either the Administratum or the Mechanicum. These teams operated under remote cloaking authority, each carrying Omega Black clearance codes granting them unrestricted access to battlefield observation zones, biological scans, and live machine ritual telemetry. 2 of the 3 teams failed to submit any final reports. The last known transmission from Team Dagger Crown reads, "System integrity compromised beyond indexable threshold. Recommend scorched record protocol. This place is not meant to be." That phrase, scorched record protocol, refers to the Inquisition's most extreme classification strategy. In effect, it denotes a zone or object as permanently non-recoverable by human understanding. Administratum records may record events in broad strokes. The Adeptus Mechanicus may analyze systems to the atom. But the Inquisition, in such circumstances, declares certain truths incompatible with continued human function. Beta-Garmon, by the war's final year, was designated such a zone. This designation was retroactively applied to all internal reports and findings. For centuries afterward, even senior inquisitors required personal appeals to the Senatorum Imperialis to access these documents. A significant portion remained sealed. One of the few unsealed records comes from Inquisitor Sile Varant, whose personal memoirs were found encoded into the sublayer of a corrupted cogitator fragment recovered near Furness's heart. Her writings describe the early stages of the war not in military terms but in symbolic terms, ritualistic phenomena occurring in tandem across battlefronts with no apparent cause and effect relationship. She records seeing a Skitarii cohort marching into battle while singing without command. She notes rivers of metallic dust forming patterns visible only from orbit. She describes Titans refusing to fire, not from damage or power loss, but from internal conflict within their machine spirits. In one entry she writes, "These machines dream in anguish. They remember dying once, and fear doing so again." Her statements were corroborated, partially, by the testimony of a captured Dark Mechanicum tech adept, extracted from a broken forge construct near Hive Delta. Interrogated under null field and exposed to 3 sanctioned psychers, the adept, known only by the machine code XK7, confirmed that certain engines in the traitor forces were not newly forged but resurrected. Their god engines had previously been destroyed in other wars on other worlds. According to XK7, the Legio Mortis no longer builds, they dig, their forges are tombs. These revelations led to the inclusion of Beta-Garmon in the Inquisition's long-standing concern with war echo convergence, a theory positing that some battlefields experience residual trauma across the veil of time, creating sites of supernatural recurrence. The Horus Heresy, it was believed, did not simply visit Beta-Garmon, it returned to it. Other findings emerged from inquisitorial recovery missions in the post-war era. Deep in the shattered remains of Vault Forge Kalis, an Ordo Xenos reconnaissance unit recovered a stasis capsule buried under 100 meters of ferrocrete, shielding, and collapsed reactor shell. Inside was a perfectly preserved organic specimen, human, male, wearing armor identified as late Unification-era Pan-Pacific pattern. The armor was engraved with Terran tribal glyphs that had not been seen for over 5,000 years. No identification markers, no Vox chip, no rank insignia. The subject's genetic structure was found to be partially compatible with known Primarch-derived gene lines, though it showed heavy artificial alterations consistent with pre-Primarch experimentation. The subject never awoke. The capsule and the facility were both declared Class Omega xenocontamination zones and sealed indefinitely. Internal Inquisition notes speculate that the subject may have been the product of pre-Imperial techno-sorcery, an abandoned Thunder Warrior hybrid, or something more obscure entirely. Alongside these discoveries, multiple cases of psychic instability were documented within Loyalist forces stationed at Beta-Garmon. A high incidence of spontaneous martyrdom among non-Psyker soldiers occurred during the final months of the siege. Numerous guardsmen were witnessed charging traitor Titans without orders, without cover, and often without weapons. Vox recordings recovered from a downed command center revealed one such instance. An entire company of Ostroyan firstborn breaking rank and sprinting toward a Reaver Titan while chanting verses from the Lectitio Divinitatus, only to be obliterated mid-charge. Inquisitorial analysts could not confirm any presence of psychic suggestion or chaos influence. Some theorized that the sheer psychic trauma of the battlefield had rendered the soldiers susceptible to mass hysteria. Others, however, argued that such acts were evidence of latent Imperial faith taking on a proto-saintly form, a phenomenon later seen in the birth of the Ecclesiarchy's martyr cults. Inquisitor Hallex Tarn of the Order Hereticus later reported that 2 astropathic stations in the Garmon system began producing unauthorized transmissions during the conflict's peak. These messages, when decoded, were revealed to be Imperial Creed scripture, not from the Lectitio Divinitatus, but from a variant version bearing archaic syntax and phrases no longer in use. The stanzas referenced "a lord upon the wheel of metal thrones" and "a mothering spark lost beneath dead stars." Neither line corresponds with any known sanctioned religious material. The stations were both destroyed in short order. No physical evidence of their message archives survived. However, 3 inquisitorial operatives were placed into stasis after reading the full transcript, reportedly to preserve their mental cohesion pending further investigation. Finally, an anomalous energy signature was detected during the collapse of the orbital network above Furness's heart. Ordo Kronos agents, rarely deployed in open war zones, confirmed that this signal matched no known power source. Its waveform was found to be identical to that of a chronotronic resonance beacon, a theoretical device proposed by Black Library scholars that, in theory, allows limited manipulation of time within isolated zones. The signal was triangulated to a ruined comms relay just outside the destroyed command spire of Furness's heart. Attempts to extract the beacon failed when the entire facility vanished from orbital auspex in less than 2 seconds. Debris scans later found that the surrounding terrain had also shifted by approximately 7 meters, suggesting a brief spatial displacement event. Ordo Kronos designated the region a Level 9 Anachron field. No further access has been granted. As the siege approached its most catastrophic phase, the Ordo Malleus deployed 2 full-strike teams into the Beta-Garmon system. Both operated under absolute silence mandates, logged in the Black Vault Index as Conflagration Echo 1 and Conflagration Echo 2. These were not intended for battlefield reinforcement. Their objective was surveillance, confirmation of warp-based anomalies, and possible containment. Surveillance pick captures later extracted from these teams' sealed Vox hubs showed evidence of demonic bleed not only near traitor-held territory, but among Loyalist lines. This included reports of Imperial guardsmen experiencing dreams of golden light melting into oil, Skitarii behaving as if entranced by invisible rituals, and confirmed audio records of Titans whispering words in a language that remained undecipherable by both Nospheric cipher and low Gothic decryption. The pick captures were flagged by the Inquisition's internal cognitae as interference by preverbal entities, a classification used only for incidents that predate language itself. The files also indicate several confrontations between the Ordo's operatives and Mechanicus personnel on the ground. One recorded clash involved Inquisitor Audrey Fontaine and a Forge Fane Archmagos at the Hellas subvault. The Inquisitor had attempted to seize a Mechanicus archive engine believed to house encrypted battlefield psi mapping data, but the Archmagos refused access, declaring the machine divinely singular and beyond the jurisdiction of both Inquisition and Forge law. The encounter escalated to open gunfire. Fontaine was mortally wounded, and the tech priest later immolated himself within the vault. The event was never reported through official channels, and the data engine was later found stripped of all memory cores. Forensic rites conducted by Ordo Machinum specialists found melted auramite traces within the engine's core, a material not known to exist within Mechanicus production libraries. This prompted a brief inquisitorial hearing questioning whether off-world custodial artifacts had been involved in the Beta-Garmon conflict. The hearing was terminated before conclusion. Among the more disturbing findings logged in inquisitorial after-action records were a set of Vox Seer glyphs, recovered from the wreckage of the orbital relays near Furnace's heart. These glyphs were transmitted without source ID, in a rhythm resembling binary prayer codes, but interspersed with numeric sequences that, when translated, corresponded to exact dates and coordinates of major defeats during the Age of Apostasy, an event that occurred thousands of years after the heresy. Ordo Chronos representatives present during the analysis declared the data a potential causality fracture and classified the glyphs under temporal paradox subset 5. Attempts to track the origin of the glyphs led to a void point in orbital logs, where all previous satellite records for that time segment were missing. Multiple psychers exposed to the message suffered immediate cranial hemorrhaging. Suppressed entries from Ordo Hereticus interrogations reveal further disturbing reports taken from captured traitor Astartes during the siege. A member of the Word-Bearers Legion, wounded and held in a containment coffin aboard the black ship Regret of Trinovantes, claimed that the entire Beta-Garmon campaign had been designed as a faith furnace, a ritual site engineered to produce and burn belief in order to feed a greater demonic construct located outside time. He described the war zone not as a battlefield, but as a liturgy written in ash and oil. According to his ravings, the Warmaster Horus had no intention of taking Terra directly through Beta-Garmon. Instead, he had intended to siphon the belief of those who died there and anchor it into an emergent warp form that would pave the way for post-Terran ascendancy. This claim was deemed heretical distortion under interrogation protocol, but was cross-checked with a separate transcript found in the ruins of a traitor psi vault, wherein a demon bound in soul metal repeated similar phrasing. These descriptions align with increasingly erratic behaviour recorded among surviving Titan crews of Legio Solaria and Astorum. In the final days before the evacuation of the Beta-Garmon system, several princeps were recorded speaking in split voice, one vocal line in Gothic, the other layered beneath in a distorted cadence. Tech priests attempted multiple exorcisms of affected Titans with limited success. One Warlord engine was found completely stationary for 3 consecutive days, its reactor still functional, while its princeps remained locked in a catatonic state. When the hatches were forcibly opened, the cockpit interior had aged several decades beyond the outside hull's condition. that Titan was later scuttled and its remains loaded onto a quarantine barge bound for Mars under Ordo Redactum jurisdiction. No records of its arrival exist. In a later classified document from Inquisitor Magus Trine of the Ordo Xenos, an anomalous biological encounter is described within the collapsing ridgelines of Garmon V's western subcontinent. While accompanying a Deathwatch kill team investigating unexplained deaths among both Imperial and Traitor forces, Trine's unit encountered what appeared to be a humanoid entity constructed entirely of non-metallic crystal. The being offered no signs of aggression and reportedly generated low harmonic vibrations that incapacitated mechanical devices in a 3-meter radius. It dissolved upon contact with a plasma bolt. Examination of the residue revealed non-carbonic compounds exhibiting quantum resonance behaviours never before observed in known species. Trine's full report was restricted, and the data samples transferred to a sealed vault beneath Luna's southern pole. Several members of the kill team were later reassigned to long-term silence postings on distant penal moons. At the strategic level, Inquisition observations also noted a disturbing pattern among the surviving civilian population. As standard infrastructures failed and rationing collapsed, enclaves of survivors began displaying spontaneous religious unification, chanting, fasting and self-immolation with no clear origin of organisation. In Hive Dagon, over 30,000 people reportedly built a cathedral out of battlefield scrap within 7 days, despite having no construction equipment. Satellite images confirm the structure's presence, though it collapsed during an orbital strike hours after its completion. No blueprints or markings were ever found. Witnesses described the structure as impossibly balanced, with support beams defying gravity. This phenomenon was flagged under Ordo Hereticus Manifestation Code Zeta Revelation, a designation reserved for unauthored acts of mass piety with potential demonic influence. One of the final Joint Inquisition Mechanicus investigations before the total collapse of Furness's heart focused on the Forge's central cogitator cluster, which had begun outputting strange mathematical patterns across unsecured data feeds. These patterns resembled no known encryption, command code or system error. However, when arranged spatially, the characters formed glyphic patterns nearly identical to those found on Necron pylons recovered in the Pariah Nexus. The Mechanicus denied this possibility. The Inquisition did not. A joint kill team was dispatched to the data core, but contact was lost after breach. All autologs from that team terminated mid-transmission, ending with a single line, "We are seen." As the Beta-Garmon campaign reached its final weeks, a coded sequence of distress signals emerged from a disused data shrine orbiting Garmon 3. Originally built as a Martian relay in the early Great Crusade, the shrine had since been decommissioned, officially logged as inoperative due to system corrosion. But the signals it began transmitting matched the original emergency codex phrases used only by the Ordo Sinister. The content of these messages remains fully classified, but they triggered an immediate nospheric blackout order issued across 3 sectors. Black ships diverted course, astropathic choirs were silenced, and within 37 standard hours, a null-array fleet was dispatched from Saturn's outer bastion. Internal logs recovered from the fleet's command vessel, Spectre of Didraxis, show that the crew was not told the nature of their assignment. The mission directive read only, "Threat vector Ouroboros detected. Erase." Upon arrival, all communications ceased. No logs survive of what transpired in the Garmon 3 orbital belt. Only wreckage was later found, scattered across the void, and a single lifepod recovered with no biological occupant. Inside was a servo skull, still operational, repeating one phrase in an archaic, stuttering vox tone. "He is coming. He has come. He is already here." The Ordo Kronos placed a full freeze on temporal analysis of the event. Simultaneously, deep within Furness's heart, an encrypted access key was used to unlock the remnants of Vault 9 Rho. This vault, sealed since the Age of Strife, contained psi-reactive crystalline matrices buried under strata of fused adamantium and armor glass. These matrices had once been part of a failed psychic dampening experiment developed by the early Mechanicum, known only as the Arcthalamus Protocol. The project had been classified as contagious, not in the biological sense but in the informational. Exposure to the full construction blueprints reportedly caused cognitive failure in machine intelligences and recursive psychic feedback in human readers. That vault was never meant to be reopened. Who unlocked it, or why, remains unknown. What followed was the complete nullification of psionic transmission across Furnace's heart. Choirs went silent. Warp augury collapsed. A fleet of Custodes vessels attempting to establish contact with ground units received no return signal. When they arrived, they found thousands of dead psychers across dozens of structures, eyes burned out, tongues bitten through. Their deaths were silent, simultaneous, and inexplicable. In a debriefing later classified by the Ordo Telepathica, one surviving astropath from orbit described a brief auditory sensation before the silence, the sound of a child humming beneath static. The Custodes destroyed the vault without delay. Elsewhere, in the wastelands outside Hive Lameros, Inquisitor Frax Valhun of the Ordo Xenos recorded a sequence of battlefield anomalies during his final recon mission. He observed clusters of collapsed traitor infantry showing no signs of physical injury but mass cerebral degradation. Their armour bore signs of corrosion consistent with Necron disintegration weaponry, but no Necron presence was ever logged in the Beta-Garmon system. Instead, Valhun's team detected a recurring echo across shortwave vox, a mathematically perfect harmonic that mapped to known Necron-Wakefield signals, but inverted, reversed in polarity. This led Valhun to theorize that something had weaponized a temporal mirror against the traitor forces. His notes suggest the possibility that another force, perhaps unknown even to the Imperium, had intervened to contain the scale of the conflict. Before this theory could be reviewed, Valhun and his team were lost during a seismic shift event. Their final transmission simply read, "It's watching us now." One of the most deeply buried secrets within the Inquisition's archive lies beneath what was once designated Forge Node Ashtaril, a subterranean data tomb that had been excavated by the Mechanicus before the heresy began. For years, its walls were believed to contain only empty vaults and failed experimental data clusters. But during the siege's final hours, a quake caused by orbital bombardment exposed a secondary chamber, one housing a static image of a Terran-era figure seated on a throne of null stone, surrounded by ossified servo-attendants. Carbon dating revealed the bones and residual materials to be over 15,000 years old, far older than the Imperium itself. No life signature, no machine code, and no residual psychic activity were detected. Yet inquisitorial auto-scribes began recording text across their data slates without user input. The language matched no known tongue. A partial translation, achieved decades later by Ordo Redactum linguists, suggested a warning: the cycle bleeds through, there is no victory, only the remembering. All records of this chamber were later purged. The site was destroyed by plasma implosion. The Inquisition never explained what had been found there. During the final extraction effort from the Beta-Garmon system, elements of the Officio Assassinorum's Venenum Temple were dispatched to neutralize surviving witnesses of certain classified events. Over 100 Imperial officers, psychers, and even high-ranking ecclesiarchy personnel were targeted under preemptive silence orders. This suggests that the knowledge uncovered during the war was considered dangerous enough to warrant absolute memory control. Among the killed was Cardinal Varan Askell, whose sermons during the siege had reportedly sparked mass visions among entire refugee columns. Witnesses claimed that during his final sermon, his shadow cast 3 silhouettes against the wall, though only one body stood at the pulpit. He died hours later, poisoned by an unknown agent. His last words were, "The light came not from above, but from the grave." In the years following the siege of Beta-Garmon, the Ordo Historica requested limited access to declassified transcripts to construct an official record. That request was denied. Instead, a single inquisitorial note was provided, authorless, and stamped with a black sigil representing no known office. It read, "Beta-Garmon was not a battle, it was a convergence, a point of overlap. There are things in the dark between empires, things older than chaos, Indifferent to order, immune to faith, they feed on memory, on repetition, and on the illusion that history only happens once. This message was later flagged as apocryphal and removed from all records. No further inquisitorial transcripts from the Beta-Garmon system have ever been confirmed.